Right then, now we're going to take a look at some project management models, methodologies. There are many out there, lots of them are commercial, and by that I mean they're linked to either standards and qualifications that you can buy or sign up to, and there are many that are open so that anybody can just use them and adapt them. And we're going to outline a number. We're going to look at Prince2, we'll look at PMP, traditional or waterfall, Scrum, Agile, and adaptive. And all the tools and techniques we've talked about from project management before can all fit into these models and methodologies. It's just a sort of structure or framework of how to go about things and where to focus on. So let's get started by having a look at Prince. And the first is Prince2, based on the Prince methodology, projects in controlled environments. I think started mainly around MOD government sort of circles, but it's based on sevens. That's 7 principles, 7 themes, and 7 processes that you follow in this model or methodology. So first are the 7 core principles. These provide a framework for good practice, and that's really all they are. So the first is continued business justification. I suppose that speaks for itself. We need to stay clear about the return on the investment. So that'll be in the business case as we've identified. The next is learn from experience, take lessons from previous projects into account. So Prince2 always looks about keeping the same format and rolling on from the last project. 3 is to define roles and responsibilities. Everyone in the project should know about what they're doing and what others are doing. And we've highlighted that when we talked about the Reiki matrix. Need to be managed by stages, so make sure the project is broken into small chunks or management stages, and those should be managed by exception. So if things are running well, there shouldn't be a lot of intervention from managers, and the project board should only be informed if there's something really going wrong or something that might go wrong. It then says it should be definitely focused on the product, so everyone should be aware of the product requirements, and that should determine what work they're doing rather than the other way around. And it should be tailored to the environment. Prince2 should not be followed dogmatically. It should be scaled and tailored to meet the needs of the project if you want it to succeed. The 7 themes, and they give us an insight into what the focus should be on how the project is being managed. They help us set up and monitor throughout, constantly revisiting them to keep us on track. And the first is the business case, which goes with that first core principle, so we need to monitor that. Then it's the organisation, about making sure we define the roles and responsibilities in principle and everyone knows what's going on. Then quality, related to the focus on the product's principles and maintaining that quality. And then plans, how we've targeted things to be achieved, what the products, the timescales, the costs, the quality, the benefits. And then risk, identifying, assessing and controlling any uncertain events during the project, risk logs, risk registers, and more about that in the final session. And then change, how we handle change requests and issues that arise during the project. And again, we're going to cover that in the final session. And then finally, number 7, about overall tracking of the project's progress. And finally, the 7 processes. So it's separating the running into some key areas, 7 key areas that Prince2 defines. And the first one is to start up the project. So create the project mandate, and we've talked about that mandate when we were discussing the documents. So the thing that's giving us the purpose of the project, etc., and all the bits and pieces, so that we can initiate the project, really realizing what needs to be done to be able to complete it and start really planning it. We can direct the project, so the ongoing process is from the beginning to the end. The controlling stage, authorizing the work packages, breaking the project down into the little tasks that people need to do, and assigning them to teams and managers. Managing the project delivery and controlling and delivering the outcomes of those work packages. Managing stage boundaries, so that's reviewing at every stage, and Prince2 says that the project board should at each stage decide whether to continue the project, what lessons have been learned, plan the next stages, update the project plan, and then closing the project. So decommissioning the project, handing over what's been produced, clearing down any resources, preparing evaluation and benefit reports, and we'll talk more about the closing a project in the final session. So that's the sort of principles, themes and processes that Prince2 is built around. And as I said, it's a commercial methodology, and you can assign your organization to it. You can train people in Prince2, and then you can sign people off to say that it's a Prince2 project. So next we'll take a look at PMP, Project Management Professional, and that's certified by the Project Management Institute, and they provide training, certification, etc. So commercial again, but this one is based on what they call the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide, which is a book, an international text which provides fundamentals of project management that are applicable to all projects. So the PMBOK is based on 5 processes. So 5 basic processes, so that's what we need to do, and then 10 knowledge areas, what they say we need to know. And these are typical to, as I said, to any projects. So let's take a quick look at them. So the 5 process groups, the do's in this area, are exactly the same as the project life cycle: initiate, planning, executing, controlling and monitoring, and closing. Follows the project life cycle as we've already discussed. And the knowledge areas are what we need to know about. So they're typical areas that we've started to cover already and talked about. So project integration, knowing how to define, consolidate, coordinate all the processes and activities so that we can set expectations and keep communication lines open. Scope, about managing the scope of the project to ensure that we are meeting all the requirements and that we remain within any limits. Project time, ensuring it's completed before the deadline or on the deadline. Managing budgets in the costs, spending, funding, allocations, timing, those sort of costs, and making sure that we manage those costs dependent on the activity and the estimates that we put in on the budget that we talked about. And then talks about project quality, defining the success of the project or the criteria that we're going to use, so the measures of success, and we'll talk more about that in the next section, and maintaining the quality at each stage of the project, so there's continuous improvement, which we've talked about. Human resources, managing your project team, like sourcing, hiring, assigning roles, personal development, professional development, and fostering team spirit just to keep the team motivated. Communication, about how we're going to devolve information amongst the team members, external stakeholders, making sure that everyone understands the communication strategy or plan that we've put together. Risk, preparing and managing unexpected risk, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next section, but we've already talked about risk logs and registered. Project procurement, the planning, the budgeting, the purchasing of resources in order to complete the project, and then project stakeholders involved with identifying who is impacted by the project. We talked about this in building relationships, the unit, when we talked about stakeholder mapping, but for the project, collaborating with the stakeholders to make sure that the project is going in the right direction and being executed correctly, and that everybody feels, as we've talked about before, engaged. Next is probably the simplest, and that's traditional waterfall, which is just a sequential linear process for managing a project. It consists of a number of distinct separate phases, and no phase is meant to begin until the previous phase has been completed. So each phase should be terminal and it should complete before the next one starts. The basic waterfall management doesn't really allow for you to return to the previous stage unless you revisit and start that phase again. Okay, the previous phase again. So it's not really that flexible or that adaptable. And the strictness comes from its roots in manufacturing and construction. I think construction is a good example, because once the foundations are laid, you build on those foundations. You know, you pour concrete, you can't go back and say, oh, we're going to go and change that. So it's for a manufacturing or process driven sort of thing, really, and can be quite inflexible. But to get around that, there have been developments, and as with anything, it's been adapted and added. So, for example, on the one we've got on the screen, after that testing phase, we might realise there's something wrong and go back to the design phase. So it can be adapted, and there can be routes back to previous steps. But to be effective, it really needs a strong requirement or scope at the start. So we really need to know exactly what we're doing before we start, because changes can cause adverse impacts on time and cost and could involve us going all the way back to the beginning. And if we are going to have changes, we're going to need to have some strict change control mechanisms in place to manage that, and we'll be talking about them more in the next session. So that's traditional waterfall. Next, we'll take a look at Agile and Scrum together because they're often linked, and we'll see that as we go through. But Agile is based on short development cycles called sprints or iterations. So it's heavily focused on the old continuous development improvement, and by repeating those sprints and those iterations, we can improve things as we go along. So the methodology works around breaking projects into small chunks, those sprints and iterations, and each of those can be completed from a design phase through testing and quality assurance by a team, and that allows those teams to complete those things and continuously release things for the next sort of session or segment that's going to be done. And each one can be deemed successful, so we get those small wins. Each one can be deemed successful, or if not, fixed quickly before we move on to the next one. So the overall idea is that we're reducing the chances of a large-scale failure or the whole project failing by developing things through continuous small project life cycles. This means that an agile project management process doesn't really need the participation of a dedicated project manager all the time, whereas we talked about it in discussion before, and we've talked about the project manager's role being essential, and in most other models it is, because they got responsibilities like the budget, the personnel, project scope, quality requirements, all those other key elements. Under agile, this is often spread amongst those responsible for the individual iterations. However, to do that, you need strong communications and rapid and detailed feedback between the teams that are doing the iterations. You need flexible and adaptable team members. They've got to be able to continually adapt and change, and that comes from a culture of continuous development and improvement within the organization. And you need good quality assurance processes and procedures across all the iterations, because they all need to follow some sort of quality process. So can be very flexible and adaptable and quick in some processes. And for all that to work, you really need someone to sort of facilitate things, and that's where Scrum comes in, because Scrum is really just a framework for project management that focuses on teamwork, accountability, and an iterative process towards sort of the overall goal, because each iteration has got its own goal. So it has a role called the Scrum Master, whose responsibility is to be that facilitator of, say, an agile team. And because the Scrum methodology allows the team to self-organize and make changes quickly in accordance with the agile principles, the Scrum Master is responsible for managing the process of the information flow and making sure everything comes together. So the framework for Scrum is really a simple premise. You start with what can be seen or what is known, and after that you track the progress and tweak as necessary. But to be effective, it's supported by three key pillars from Scrum, which are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So different than the other processes we've looked at, the methods, models, and therefore there are different roles. In Scrum you have a product owner, as you would have in any of the traditional sort of model, and then you have a Scrum Master that we've talked about, and then you have the development team, so that might be the agile development team. But it bases on that pillar that you've got to have those pillars there, that you've got to have transparency, there's got to be some form of inspection, and it has to have a lot of adaptation and flexibility for it to work. And the final one we'll take a look at is the Adaptive Project Framework, APF, said to be a systematic process which is structured for continually improving decisions, policies, processes, and as the name suggests, it's based on regularly adapting to the circumstances using collaboration and are similar to Agile, with iterative small chunks forming an ongoing change development program. APF is quite a recent one, and I think it was 2008, but at the core of its heart are three things: that it's client driven, you learn from discovery, and it thrives on change. And what that means, in contrast to a lot of the other models we've looked at, is that the client determines each next step as the project develops. And the client is also the person in control if they want to totally change the direction or the scope of the project. So quite different to a lot of the other ones we've talked about. And to do that, it's like Agile. Each step has to be divided up into really small mini projects so that it can react to change at any stage throughout the process. But for that to be able to work, there has to be some core values for APF. And those values are not speculating on the future. All the non-value added stuff that you might do in other projects has to be stripped out, because you need to resist that temptation to be striving to perfect things too early, as you don't want to waste time or money on guessing what the client might want to do next, or where they might be going with it. Because remember, we said it's in little mini projects and it could change, because change is required in this process. It's about going on to reach the best solution. And it's all part of the bigger picture of determining, sort of as you go along, what might be done to improve the results and where it might go. And because you don't know exactly where you're going, you've got to be thinking about changes coming along. And that involves continuous introspection and questioning. You've got to be looking at yourself all the time and questioning people all the time about where we're going, what we're doing, how's this going, because you've got to stay on top of where they want those requirements to be. And as we mentioned, it's client driven. The client is going to be heavily involved in that process. And it's definitely client focused. It's all about staying focused on what the client wants and what they need. So as long as it stays within the scope of what you originally started out to do, and it doesn't break any ethical sort of practices that the company or the organization's got, then that's fine. But it's about maintaining those and being focused on learning and developing and changing as you go along. So we're just coming to the end of this second session now, and we've covered a lot in the 4 parts. We set out with an overall aim to know how to set up a project, and we said by the end of the session you'd be able to explain how to carry out a cost-benefit analysis of a project. We've done that. We said you'd be able to describe the considerations when setting up and agreeing a project budget. We looked at the budgets at the beginning. 2.3 was that you'd evaluate project planning tools and techniques, and 2.4 was to evaluate the use of risk analysis tools and techniques. And we've looked at some planning tools and we've looked at some risk analysis tools, and in your assignment at the end you'll be asked to evaluate those. We've described some documentation used in the setup and the management of a project. We went through the mandate and the project plan and Reiki matrix, etc. And then we've just described a range of different project management models when we went through Prince, Agile, Waterfall, etc. So that's the end of this session.